bury a log in the ground. Push a little strip of copper into the soil nearby. Water it once, then leave it alone. For a while, nothing about that looks impressive. From the surface, it just looks like dirt doing what dirt always does. Quiet. A little flat. Nothing you would film for a grand reveal. But underneath, the whole bed starts changing its behavior. That buried wood begins pulling in moisture from every direction and holding it in place. The outside softens first, then the inside. Fungi start moving through it. Bacteria wake up and go to work on the carbon. The soil around it stays darker, cooler, and damper longer than the ground beside it. Roots start drifting toward that pocket. And if you stay with that image long enough, really let it sit in your mind, the question starts rising on its own. What if soil has been doing more than we were taught to notice because most people were trained to think of soil as a passive medium? A container? Something that holds roots while you solve every real problem from the outside with bags, bottles, hoses, and another trip to the store. But the longer you garden, the harder that story is to believe. Soil stores, soil trades, soil buffers, soil remembers. And once you start seeing it that way, a lot of old practices that got brushed aside as folklore start looking less like superstition and more like fragments of a system we stopped respecting. The easiest place to start is with the log. Long before hugelkultur became a modern gardening keyword, people in Central and Eastern Europe were burying wood under their planting beds because they noticed what happened afterward. The bed stopped behaving like ordinary ground. It held on to rain. It gave some of that moisture back during hot, dry stretches. The inside of the mound stayed biologically active. Over time, it got softer, richer, darker, and more forgiving. Sepp Holzer helped popularize that method for modern audiences, but the observation behind it is much older than one name. Put wood in the ground, cover it well, and watch what changes. And you can feel those changes in very ordinary moments. You go out after a week of heat and expect the bed to be stressed, but when you press your hand below the surface, the soil is still cool. You notice the plants hanging on better than the ones in the drier bed 10 feet away. The top layer may look dusty, but underneath the roots are still finding moisture because that buried wood has become a sponge beneath them. Not metaphorically, physically. It swells. It holds. Then, when the surrounding soil dries down, it starts giving some of that stored water back. That alone is enough to matter. A self-watering effect that comes from buried wood and patience is not a small thing, especially when you compare it with how many gardeners get trapped in the cycle of buying irrigation parts, timers, extra mulch, liquid feeds, and one more fix for a bed that was built too shallow and too sterile to regulate itself in the first place. A rotting log in the ground looks unimpressive right up until the week the rain doesn't come. Then it starts looking smart. And moisture is only part of the story. As that wood breaks down, it feeds an underground population boom. Fungal threads move in first, almost like white wiring through the grain. Then bacteria. Then all the other tiny workers that make a bed feel alive instead of merely occupied. Worms, beetles, springtails, mites, everything that turns dead material into movement again. The wood becomes habitat, not debris. The whole zone turns into a place where organic matter is constantly being translated into forms roots can actually use. That process gives off heat too, not in a dramatic, steaming compost pile way most of the time, but enough to matter. Enough to change the feel of the bed. Enough to warm the root zone a little earlier, hold activity a little longer, soften the edges of the season. Which means that buried wood is already doing more than one job. It is a water reservoir, a microbial food source, a long, slow fertility engine, a temperature buffer, and that is before you even get to the strangest part of it. Because decomposition is not only a biological story, it is also, quietly, an electron story. That is where some people pull back, which is fair. Soil electricity can sound like the part where a good gardening conversation gets hijacked by people who want the impossible to be true, so badly that they stop being careful. So let's stay careful. In 2024, researchers at Northwestern University published work on a soil-powered fuel cell that harvested electrical output from microbes as they broke down carbon in the soil. The scale was small. The application was practical, low-power sensing. But the principle matters a lot. Living soil under active microbial decomposition can produce measurable electrical output, not as a metaphor, not as a mystical vibration, as a physical result of microbes moving electrons while they metabolize organic material. That does not prove every grand claim people make about electric soil. What it does prove is something subtler and, in a way, more important. Rich, active soil is not inert. It is not chemically asleep. When carbon, moisture, microbes, and mineral exchange all come together, the ground begins behaving less like dead fill and more like a living system with its own internal traffic. Once you accept that much, a buried log stops looking like yard waste. It starts looking like stored carbon, stored water, stored biology, and, under the right conditions, a site of ongoing electrical exchange as well. Now, widen the frame. Leave the backyard for a minute and go to the Amazon, where some of the natural ground is so poor that long-term agriculture should have been nearly impossible. Thin soil, acidic soil, fast decomposition, nutrients that don't stay put. And yet there are pockets of black earth there so rich they are still productive centuries later. Terra preta, dark earth. Soil that should not exist if you believe fertility is something you can only pour in from the outside every season. When researchers looked closely, they did not find a miracle handed down by weather. They found evidence of intention. Charcoal, fish bones, food waste, pottery shards, human beings building the ground on purpose. That matters because it changes the whole emotional meaning of soil. It means someone understood a very long time ago that the ground could be made to accumulate life instead of merely spending it. And biochar is one of the keys to that. If you pick up a handful of crushed hardwood charcoal, it doesn't look like much. It stains your fingers black. It looks dry, light, almost empty. But under magnification, it is full of tiny chambers and tunnels. A single gram of wood-based biochar can contain up to around 9,000 square feet of internal surface area, which is why it matters so much in soil. Water can cling there. Nutrients can cling there. Microbes can live there. What looks like black dust in your hand becomes, underground, a kind of permanent housing for biological life and mineral exchange. That is why biochar changes the character of a bed. In sandy soil, it helps hold moisture that would otherwise rush straight through. In heavier ground, it improves aeration and structure. In chemical terms, it gives nutrients somewhere to stay close to the root zone instead of washing away with the next rain. Calcium, potassium, ammonium, magnesium, zinc, the ground has a better chance of holding them where the plants can actually find them, and because biochar can improve conductivity in the soil as well, it becomes a bridge material in this whole buried system. Not flashy, not fast, just incredibly persistent. There is one practical warning here that matters enough to say out loud. Fresh biochar is hungry. If you bury it raw, it can pull nutrients out of circulation before your plants get access to them, so it needs to be charged first. Compost tea works. Worm casting suspended in water work. Diluted fish emulsion works. Even diluted urine works if you are realistic and clean about it. The point is simple. Load that charcoal before it goes into the bed. Let the pores fill up. Let the microbial life begin moving in. Then, when it enters the soil, it starts by giving and holding, not by robbing the root zone. So now the buried picture is getting clearer. Wood below holds water, feeds decomposition, and supports the microbial side of the system. Charged biochar above that catches nutrients, supports microbes, improves structure, and keeps useful chemistry from leaving the bed so quickly. Even if the story stopped right there, you would already have something worth building. A bed that matures instead of collapsing. A bed that asks less from you the longer it lives. But the old trail keeps going. Back in the 19th century, Alexander Bain buried zinc and copper in a damp ground and used the earth itself as part of a battery system. Wet mineral soil carrying ions between different metals. Quiet direct current. It sounds like a strange experiment until you remember that telegraph engineers later used earth return methods too, because the ground was not just where the wires were buried. The ground was part of the circuit. And then there's that detail that refuses to leave the mind once you hear it. People noticed the vegetation above some of those buried lines could look different. Darker, thicker, more vigorous. Not a perfect miracle stripe every time. Not something that should be turned into a cartoon, but enough to be noticed. Enough to be remembered. Enough to leave behind the unsettling possibility that the electrical life of the ground and the biological life above it were not as separate as people assumed. That kind of clue is exactly how gardening knowledge often survives, by the way. Not as a clean theory first. As an odd patch of grass. A row that grows differently. A place where roots seem to want to go. And then the story gets stranger still. The image of Stubblefield's farm is unforgettable. Lights hanging in trees, coils buried near the roots, the glow visible from the road. Then the voice demonstrations. Children hearing a voice through a receiver on Christmas Eve, 1901. Long before most people would expect a farm field to be part of an electrical experiment like that. Now this is where discipline matters. Forgotten inventors attract legend the way old houses attract vines. Stories grow around them. Claims get polished in the retelling, so the honest posture here is not to believe every dramatic version automatically. The honest posture is to say this much. There really was a line of experimentation here. There were real patents, and there were real attempts to treat the ground itself as an active electrical medium instead of dead backdrop. That alone is enough to make you stop and rethink what got abandoned. By the time those pieces sit beside each other, the pattern starts showing itself. Not as a simple, universal formula, more like a forgotten direction of attention. Buried wood changes water behavior. Active decomposition changes biology. Biochar changes storage, structure, and nutrient retention. Damp mineral soil and dissimilar metals can create measurable voltage. Modern research shows microbial soil systems can move electrons in usable ways. None of those ideas needs to be inflated beyond what it can carry. Put together, they are already powerful, because they point toward a different way of building a garden bed. Not a shallow container you keep rescuing from the outside. Not a yearly appetite disguised as a system. Something deeper. Slower, more self-respecting. If you wanted to test that idea in your own yard, I would build downward. At the bottom goes the wood layer. Not treated lumber, not painted scraps, not stained boards. Untreated hardwood is what you want. Old branches, half-rotted logs. Fruitwood, maple, oak, birch, alder, something that will actually soften and become part of the soil over time. Leave black walnut out because juglone can suppress other plants. Be cautious with woods like cedar and redwood because they break down very slowly and can stall the process if you are waiting for a bed to come alive on a normal gardener's timeline. Lay the biggest pieces first, then smaller branches in the gaps. Around them, add greens and softer organics to balance the carbon. Dry leaves for carbon and moisture buffering. Grass clippings for nitrogen and microbial heat. Vegetable scraps for soft, wet decomposition. Coffee grounds in moderation. Banana peels, if you have them. Eggshells, if they're crushed, fine enough to be useful over time. Small twigs for structure. Not as a garbage pit, as a layered reservoir with materials that break down at different speeds and do different jobs. Then comes the charcoal zone. Clean hardwood charcoal, crushed down, charged properly, then worked into the upper layer with compost. That is where the bed starts getting more intelligent chemically. Nutrients released from below have somewhere to be caught. Moisture has somewhere to linger. Microbes have somewhere to settle into a more stable home. The buried wood below will gradually disappear into dark soil. The biochar will stay. Years from now, when the original log is mostly memory and humus, that black carbon will still be down there holding charge, holding nutrients, holding biological life in place. Above that goes your planting soil. And only then, only if you want to test the electrical layer carefully, do you add the copper and zinc. 1 pair per plant is enough. That part deserves restraint because this is exactly where excitement can turn into nonsense. It is vital to insist on restraint here. A small copper piece on one side of the plant, a galvanized zinc nail on the other, spaced modestly apart in moist soil. That is an experiment. Filling a bed with metals because more sounds better is not an experiment. It is a shortcut to contaminating the very system you were trying to improve. Zinc is useful in small amounts and harmful in excess. Copper can become hostile to beneficial life if you get careless. So the electrical layer has to stay small, measured, and honest. Enough to observe. Not enough to bully the bed. What makes that 3-layer stack so compelling is that every layer still makes sense even if you refuse to overclaim. The wood layer stores water, feeds decomposition, and keeps the lower bed biologically active. The biochar layer catches nutrients, supports microbial life, and improves the soil's ability to hold on to what matters. The copper-zinc pair, used carefully, adds a measurable galvanic element in a root zone that is already more conductive and more alive than plain dirt. That is not fantasy. That is design. And because the design is layered, each piece helps the others work better. The wood keeps the soil moist enough for biological activity and for the metal pair to function more consistently. The biochar catches nutrients mobilized through decomposition and mineral exchange. The root zone above benefits from water stored below, chemistry stabilized in the middle, and a small electrical gradient if you choose to test it. What you end up with is not a gadget buried in a bed. It is a bed built to behave like a living machine underground. If you try it, document it. Use a multimeter if you want to track the metal pair. Run a control row if you have the room. Same seeds, same light, same watering, but no electrical layer. Maybe even no buried wood in the comparison bed if you really want to see what is doing what. Take weekly photos. Put a ruler in the frame. Weigh the harvest. If you are the kind of gardener who likes numbers, use a refractometer and track bricks. The point is not to turn a backyard into a science fair. The point is to protect yourself from falling in love with a theory before the plants have had their say. Honest observation is part of garden sovereignty too, and that brings us to the part people are often tempted to say too loudly, too early. The villain in this story does not need a secret meeting in a dark room. The logic is simpler than that. Why would a market built on seasonal dependency get excited about systems that become more stable with time? A buried log does not create recurring revenue. Charged charcoal that lasts for years does not create recurring revenue. A bed that stores its own moisture better, hangs on to nutrients longer, and asks less from the gardener. Each season does not create recurring revenue. But fertilizer cycles do. Pesticide cycles do. Corrective product cycles do. The whole retail habit of building shallow problems and then selling annual fixes for them does. That is the real tension here. Not some theatrical claim that every institution conspired in perfect unison. Just a very old and very familiar economic truth. Systems that last are harder to monetize than systems that wear out on schedule. And once you see that, a lot of forgotten soil knowledge starts looking less mysterious. It starts looking economically inconvenient. That is why I think the phrase infinite energy is useful as a hook, but incomplete as a conclusion. The deepest payoff here is not that soil might produce a trickle of measurable electricity. The deeper payoff is that you can build a garden bed that behaves less like a hungry container and more like a maturing ecosystem. One that stores more of what falls into it. One that loses less of what it has already earned. One that feeds more life below the surface. One that asks less from you because it is doing more for itself. That is the kind of garden worth building. Not because it is ancient, not because it sounds rebellious, not because every claim attached to it has to be pushed to the limit, because it gives ordinary people leverage. A chunk of rotting wood can be free. Leaves are free. Kitchen scraps are already in your house. Charcoal, once prepared well, lasts. A galvanized nail costs almost nothing. A small piece of copper lasts season after season. Compare that with the usual rhythm. Buy the mix, buy the fertilizer, buy the stimulant, buy the rescue product for the problem the first two didn't solve, then come back next spring and do it again. Over and over, as if depletion were the natural condition of every bed and dependency were just the price of gardening. It doesn't have to be. A good bed will never free you from weather. It will never free you from paying attention. It will never replace skill. But it can reduce how often you need to solve the same problem with money. And that is a real kind of independence. So maybe the buried secret is not that the ground is hiding some magical generator waiting to replace the grid. Maybe it is something quieter. Better, even. That under the right conditions, soil can be built to store, host, buffer, feed, conduct, and regenerate far more than modern gardening culture usually admits. Once you see that, a rotting log stops looking like trash. A handful of charged charcoal stops looking like black dust. A carefully placed copper-zinc pair stops looking like a gimmick and starts looking like a question worth testing. And the best part is, you do not need permission to test it. You can bury the wood. You can charge the char. You can watch what changes. You can measure what happens. You can learn from your own ground. That is how forgotten knowledge comes back. Not all at once. Not as ideology. Not as one more product category. Bed by bed. Season by season. One patch of soil at a time. If this changed the way you think about what a garden bed can be, pass it to somebody who grows things. Because sometimes the fastest way to recover buried knowledge is not to argue about it. Sometimes it is to plant it.